August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the sky flashed white. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released a single bomb codenamed Little Boy. For 1 second, the city glowed brighter than the sun. Then, it ceased to exist. The blast temperature reached over 3,000 degrees Celsius. People standing near ground zero evaporated. Their shadows burned into concrete. Wooden houses ignited instantly. The air itself caught fire. Within minutes, Hiroshima became a sea of flame, a city melting in its own morning light. By nightfall, more than 70,000 were dead. Tens of thousands more would follow from burns and radiation sickness. The survivors, the Hibakusha, carried wounds that time could not heal. Today, Hiroshima stands rebuilt, but the earth beneath still remembers. Beneath its streets lie the ashes of a moment when humanity crossed a line it can never uncross. The ghosts of Hiroshima still walk among us, silent, but never forgotten. But the truth goes deeper. Watch the full story on Ghost of War. The morning was clear, unnervingly clear. The kind of brightness that paints every rooftop gold and makes the air taste of heat before the day has even begun. Cicadas screamed from the trees lining the Motoyasu River. The Aioi Bridge shimmered in sunlight. Housewives opened sliding doors to let in the warmth. Children in white school uniforms gathered outside for their labor drills, sweeping debris, tending gardens, or collecting scrap metal for the war effort. In a small wooden house near the Tsurumi-cho district, a woman named Sasaki Haruko, 34, adjusted the ribbon on her daughter's hair. The girl, Mika, was 7. She laughed when Haruko told her she'd grow taller if she drank all her miso soup. There was no sense of doom, no tremor in the air. Just the quiet hum of a city that had survived every previous air raid without a single bomb falling. At 8:17 a.m., a B-29 superfortress called Enola Gay crossed over Hiroshima at 31,000 feet. Inside, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets steadied the controls while the bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, adjusted the Norden bomb sight. Beneath them, Hiroshima glistened like a photograph. Farabee released a single bomb codenamed Little Boy, weight 700 pounds. Composition uranium 235, detonation altitude 1968 feet. It fell for 43 seconds. Haruko never saw the flash. She saw only a quick burst of white, brighter than any lightning, followed by the collapse of light itself. It wasn't an explosion in the usual sense, no roar, no flame, just instant annihilation. Shadows etched themselves onto walls. People became outlines burned into stone. Mika vanished where she stood, leaving a dark silhouette of small arms stretched forward, still clutching her wooden lunchbox. At ground zero, temperature reached 3,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel and fuse sand into glass. Human bodies evaporated before they could fall. Asphalt bubbled beneath the feet of those who ran. Wooden homes, within a radius of 2 kilometers, ignited simultaneously. The sky turned orange, then black. Across the river, survivors staggered in silence, skin hanging in ribbons. A soldier from the Hiroshima Communication Bureau tried to shout orders, but his voice failed. His lungs burned from within. Children wandered without faces. A man carried his wife's body through the smoke, calling her name though her body was already a husk. The air itself tasted of iron and wet ash. Fires spread with a wind that came from nowhere, feeding on oxygen stolen from the city's last breath. Hiroshima, once a city of 350,000 towns, became an open furnace. In the distance, the Aioi Bridge still stood for a moment, framed against a rising mushroom cloud that reached 40,000 feet into the troposphere. Beneath it, the Ata River boiled. Haruko awoke hours later in what had been her home. The roof was gone. Her daughter was gone. Her own arms were blistered beyond recognition. She crawled through the smoldering remains, calling Mika's name in a voice that no longer sounded human. Each time she touched the ground, her palms stuck to the wood. Somewhere nearby, a wristwatch had stopped at 8:15. Smoke drifted low, clinging to the riverbanks like fog that refused to lift. It smelled of salt, tar, and something metallic, the scent of blood cooked into the air. The sun was dim behind the rising column of ash, its light a dull orange. By noon, Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was a landscape of bones and silence. Haruko crawled toward what she thought was the street, but there were no streets anymore, only molten glass and twisted steel rails, blackened and warped. The air shimmered with heat, and the ground hissed beneath her knees. Every breath hurt. Her skin peeled like wet paper. From behind a collapsed storehouse came a voice, a low moan. A man. His uniform burned into his flesh, stumbled out. His eyes were white with shock. "Water," he whispered. His lips were swollen, his hair gone. Haruko tore a strip from what remained of her kimono and dipped it in the mud-black water of a broken pipe, pressing it to his mouth. He swallowed once, then stopped breathing. The Ata River had become a passage for the dying. Dozens of figures floated downstream silent, swollen, drifting with the current. Some still moved weakly, hands reaching upward as if grasping for a sky that had already betrayed them. The water steamed. At 8:30, 3 kilometers from the hypocenter, a 13-year-old boy named Tanaka Keiji had been in class, reciting patriotic verses. The classroom walls had collapsed in an instant. When he crawled free, his teacher lay nearby, her body charred and fused with her desk. Keiji's uniform was on fire. He ran toward the river, screaming, slapping at the flames with his hands. By the time he reached the water, his fingernails had burned away. Around 11 Ojosin mm. The first winds from the explosion, the firestorm began to circle inward. The air pressure created a vortex, pulling oxygen from the outer districts back toward the center. Flames roared through what had been the merchant quarter. Roof tiles melted, gutters overflowed with liquid lead. Survivors who tried to flee found themselves running into the inferno. A Buddhist temple near Sakemachi became a refuge for those who could still walk. Inside, the tatami mats were soaked with blood. Dozens of burned children lay in rows, moaning softly. Their eyes were sealed shut with blisters. A priest rang the temple bell once, though no one could hear it over the crackling fire. By evening, the wind carried radioactive dust across the prefecture. It fell like gray snow, coating everything: hair, skin, wounds. The survivors called it black rain. Each drop carried death in invisible form, alpha particles that would later eat through bone marrow, turn blood to poison. At the edge of the ruins, Haruko reached the riverbank. The current was thick with bodies, the water a slow-moving mirror of flame. She saw something small caught against a half-submerged beam, a child's sandal, still intact. Its strap burned but recognizable. She knew it at once. It was Mika's. She reached for it, but her arm trembled. When her fingers touched the water, steam rose. The heat bit into her burned flesh. She drew back, pressing the sandal to her chest, the last trace of her daughter. All around her, people murmured the same word again and again: Mizu. Water, though even that could no longer save them. Those who drank from the rivers died minutes later. The water carried radiation now. Night fell without stars. Only the glow of the fires remained, flickering through the smoke, like dying embers in a black sky. The city that had once woken to morning prayers now lay in absolute quiet. In the ruins near the Aioi Bridge, a man wrote in his diary before dying, "The world has ended. We are the ghosts of the first dawn of hell." By the time dawn broke on August 7, 1945, Hiroshima was still burning. The city's outline was a negative impression against the dim horizon where houses once stood. Only shadows of foundations remained. The morning wind carried the smell of iron, scorched cloth, and decomposing flesh. No birds sang. Even insects were gone. From what had once been the Red Cross hospital, a single building still stood in partial ruin. Inside, the corridors were lined with the wounded people without names, without faces, whispering prayers to gods who had abandoned the sky. Doctors and nurses, themselves burned and bleeding, worked with what they had: strips of curtain for bandages, boiled rice water as antiseptic, shards of glass for surgical tools. Dr. Shigeru Takashi, head surgeon, recorded in his notes that day, "Their skin hangs like torn cloth. Their eyes are white with blindness. When I touch their bodies, the flesh slips away in my hands. We have no medicine left, only mercy." Outside, the streets shimmered with heat, though the bomb had fallen a day before. In the wreckage, survivors wandered aimlessly, calling for family in hoarse, cracked voices. A mother held the corpse of her child wrapped in a futon, sitting motionless among the ashes. She rocked back and forth, whispering lullabies to bones. Haruko was among those who reached the hospital courtyard. Her arms were stiff, her burns open to the air. She still carried Mika's sandal. When a nurse tried to take it, she refused, clutching it tighter, as if it still contained warmth. The hospital ran out of water by noon. Patients begged for drops from any container: a bucket, a vase, even rain pooled in bomb craters. The nurses couldn't stop them from drinking. They knew the water was poisoned. But thirst had become stronger than fear. Within hours, those who drank began bleeding from the mouth and nose, their skin turning violet beneath the ash. Farther north, near the Miyuki Bridge, hundreds of bodies floated together, moving with the slow rhythm of the tide. Some were still alive, their lips moving silently as if trying to breathe underwater. Soldiers who came to search for survivors could not tell who was living and who was not. One rescuer later recalled, "I lifted a child. She was warm, and I thought she lived. But when I turned her over, her face was gone." In the days that followed, rumors spread that the Americans had dropped a new kind of bomb, one made from the sun itself. Some said it burned without fire. Others that it drew the souls out of bodies. No one truly understood what radiation was. They only knew that wounds refused to heal. Hair fell out in clumps, and the smell of death lingered even after the wind shifted. By the third night, the fires had mostly died. The moon returned, pale and distant, reflecting faintly off pools of melted glass. Haruko lay beside the river, too weak to move. Her body trembled with fever. Her skin had turned a sickly gray. Around her, others whispered fragments of the same question. Why us? She looked at the sandal one last time. The leather strap had hardened, curled by heat. She placed it on the ground beside her, as if setting it down for Mika to find on her way home. Her eyes closed slowly. The air trembled once, like a sigh. In the center of what had been Hiroshima, silence fell again, vast, unbearable, final. The first nuclear city on Earth had ceased to exist. August 8, 1945, 2 days after the blast, the fires had burned themselves to ash, but the city still smoked like an open wound. The smell of death was sweet, now cloying, thick, soaked into every breeze. Beneath the twisted ruins of the Hondori district, the silence was broken only by the faint crackle of embers and the slow collapse of walls that had forgotten their purpose. When the first rescue teams arrived from the outskirts, soldiers, medics, and students from nearby towns, they stopped at the city's edge and stared. What had once been a landscape of rooftops and gardens was now a gray plain, where nothing cast a shadow because the light was too even, too dead. The hypocenter near Shima Hospital was nothing but bare earth, glazed into a smooth black mirror. The men moved forward in gas masks, carrying stretchers made from bamboo poles. They found few survivors. Those they did find often whispered nonsense, their throats too burned to form words. One soldier, Private Okabe, wrote in his report, "We tried to lift a woman, but her body came apart in our hands. The air was so heavy with decay that we vomited through the masks. Hiroshima was not a city anymore. It was an open grave. At the Red Cross hospital, hundreds had already died overnight. The nurses had stopped counting. They stacked the bodies in rows outside, covering them with burned tatami mats. There was no one left to cremate them, so the smell grew thicker each hour." Dr. Takashi continued writing notes in his journal, though his own hands shook from radiation sickness. "We have reached the end of medicine," he wrote. "All that remains is to witness." Haruko's body was found near the Ota River, curled beside the small sandal she had kept. The rescuers thought she was sleeping at first. Her hair was gone, her skin the color of ash. She was one of 78,000 talents dead by that morning. Another 80,000 would die in the days and weeks to come from burns, starvation, or the unseen sickness that followed. That sickness began quietly. Those who had seemed uninjured on the first day began vomiting black fluid. Their gums bled. Purple spots appeared under their skin. Hair fell in handfuls. Their wounds refused to close. Children who had drunk the black rain collapsed in their sleep, never waking again. The survivors began to fear their own shadows. On the afternoon of August 9th, the same day another bomb fell on Nagasaki. The sky over Hiroshima darkened once more, but this time from clouds heavy with rain. It fell without warning, drenching the ruins, washing the ash into the rivers. The rescuers stood motionless, unsure whether to welcome or fear it. Many opened their mouths to drink. They did not know it carried cesium, strontium, and uranium dust, the invisible residue of the new sun that had burned their city away. Beneath the Aioi Bridge, the water had turned black and oily. The corpses began to drift apart. Somewhere downstream, a cluster of white flowers floated past, tied together with a strip of torn fabric, a makeshift memorial placed by a survivor who could not find their family's remains. By the evening of August 10th, the fires had gone out completely. The wind passed through the ruins with a sound like whispering paper. The city, for the first time since the flash, was still. A few journalists entered the ruins with cameras. They did not speak. They took photographs of the burned schoolyards, the fused lunchboxes, the skeleton of the dome that would later be called Genbaku Dome. The film reels trembled in their hands as they turned the cranks. What they captured would become the first evidence of what humanity had done to itself. In one of those photographs, you can almost see her, a woman kneeling by the river, holding a small sandal. Her face is gone, but her posture speaks love, frozen in an impossible act of holding on. The next morning, the American aircraft returned not to attack, but to measure. Radiation, blast radius, burn zones, crater size. Aerial photographs were taken with meticulous precision, for science, for history, for what they called the report on the effects of the atomic bomb. Hiroshima had become both graveyard and laboratory, and yet, in that silence, amid the ashen ruin, a few still breathed. The ones who survived the fire, the sickness, the black rain. They began to dig with bare hands, searching for those who had not. They had no prayers left, only the will to remember. August 11, 1945, the fourth sunrise over Hiroshima's ruins. Dawn broke through a sky the color of bruised metal. The city was still no voices, no engines, only the faint crackle of cooling debris and the steady hiss of the river. Smoke no longer rose. It clung low, mingling with fog. Those who were left alive walked like ghosts through the wreckage, their bare feet leaving prints in the fine white ash that once had been their neighbors, their homes, their lives. In the courtyard of the Red Cross hospital, hundreds of bodies were being moved into shallow trenches. The soldiers doing the work tied rags over their faces, though the smell of decomposition soaked through anyway. They didn't speak. A single Buddhist monk stood among them, chanting under his breath. His voice was hoarse, his robe scorched, his eyes unfocused, as if the ritual were for the entire species, not just the dead. Dr. Shigeru Takashi had stopped writing. His last entry was dated August 10th. We can no longer tell who is dying of burns and who of radiation. I believe the soul leaves before the body does. Inside the hospital, those still breathing had begun to lose their hair. Wounds that had closed reopened. A strange fever spread, invisible, merciless. Children coughed blood. Mothers held them until both fell silent. The doctors called it atomic sickness because no word existed yet for what it was. In the northern district near Koi, a group of schoolgirls gathered around what remained of their teacher. She could no longer stand, but her voice was steady. "If you live," she whispered, "you must tell them." Her students nodded, though none of them knew if they would see another sunrise. Rescue workers marked areas of the city with white flags meaning no life found. By the end of that day, the flags covered almost all of central Hiroshima. Yet at the edges, small miracles persisted: a baby found alive under a collapsed floorboard, a dog limping through the ruins, a cherry tree stump, blackened but sprouting a green shoot. Haruko's body lay in a makeshift burial pit near the Oda River, among hundreds. The soldiers didn't know her name, but someone, perhaps a nurse, placed a sandal beside her before the earth was closed. It was small, half-burned, its leather strap curled. They covered the grave with a plank of wood and wrote one word in charcoal: Mother. By August 12th, the smell of decay had thickened until it became the air itself. A single American reconnaissance plane circled overhead, taking photographs of what the generals would later describe as the effects of total destruction. The people below didn't look up. They had learned that nothing good ever came from the sky. At night, the survivors gathered along the riverbank, lighting makeshift lanterns from scrap paper. The current carried them slowly downstream, hundreds of flickering lights moving through the black water, each representing someone lost. The reflection shimmered on the ruined bridge, casting faint ripples of gold across the ash. For the first time since August 6th, there was beauty, again fragile, defiant, uninvited. Among those who watched was Tanaka Keiji, the boy who had escaped his burning classroom. His hands were bandaged to the elbows. He whispered the names of his classmates to the drifting lights, one by one, until his voice was gone. Then he sat in silence, watching the river carry them away. That night, rain began to fall again, slow, cold, and black. It stained their faces, mixed with tears, and soaked the lanterns until their light dimmed and disappeared. The survivors would live, but never truly leave. The radiation would linger in their bones, in their bloodlines, in their unborn children. Some would die within weeks. Others would live decades, haunted by the same soundless flash each time they closed their eyes. They called themselves Hibakusha, the bombed people. Not victims, not heroes, just those who remained to remember what should never have been possible. And in that silence, beneath the dead city's endless sky, Hiroshima entered history not as a place, but as a warning. August 15, 1945. Hiroshima lay in ruins, a plain of gray sand where life had once been measured by the rhythm of rivers and the ring of temple bells. The fires were gone now, and in their absence came a strange calm, the kind that precedes confession. In the center of the dead city, people gathered around battery-powered radios, the static breaking into the trembling voice of Emperor Hirohito. It was the first time the nation had ever heard him speak. His words, "We must endure the unendurable," drifted through the air like a prayer half buried in dust. Some wept. Others simply stared at the horizon where Hiroshima had once stood, understanding for the first time that their suffering had not ended the war, but the world they knew. By now, the full scale of the destruction was known. Of the city's 350,000 inhabitants, over 140,000 were dead. Hospitals were gone. The wounded outnumbered the living. Animals, trees, even insects had vanished. The soil itself had turned radioactive. Puddles glowed faintly under moonlight. Keiji, the boy from the burned school, walked among the ruins with a piece of chalk he'd scavenged from a collapsed classroom. On the remains of a stone wall, he wrote the names of his classmates one after another, until there was no space left. When he ran out of names, he wrote a single question. Why then, he dropped the chalk and walked away, barefoot, toward the river. Farther north, teams from the Imperial Army's Scientific Division entered the city in protective gear, their faces hidden behind glass masks. They took sample soil, blood, bones, labeling them in careful handwriting. To them, Hiroshima was not a tragedy, but an experiment completed. They noted the blast radius, the pattern of burns, the rate of decay. Each measurement was a line in the new scripture of warfare. The Americans arrived soon after. Soldiers in clean uniforms stepped through the same streets where mothers had died holding their children. Their cameras clicked methodically. The film they carried would later be classified for decades. One of them whispered, almost to himself, "We made the sun fall." Yet amid that silence of science and sorrow, survivors began to move again. The Hibakusha gathered under makeshift tents, tending to the wounded, searching for the missing. They built small shrines from stones and wood, each marked with a name or a prayer. Some placed photographs, others placed nothing at all, because nothing was left. One of these shrines stood near the Aioi Bridge, beside a scorched cherry tree that had somehow sprouted a single green leaf. People began to leave offerings beneath it: rice, folded paper cranes, bits of glass that had melted into strange colors. That tree would later be known as the Phoenix tree, the first living thing to grow again in Hiroshima. Dr. Takashi, barely able to stand, walked there one morning. His notes were gone, burned in the fire, but his memory remained. He bowed once before the tree and whispered, "We are alive, therefore we must speak." Years later, he would testify at the International Tribunal, describing what he saw: the flash, the burns, the children, the silence. His voice never trembled. He ended with a single sentence. The human body remembers what governments forget. By the autumn of 1945, the city began to rebuild. Rubble was cleared. Temporary shelters rose. The survivors, though sick and scarred, refused to abandon the land where their families had vanished. They called the act of rebuilding not courage, but obligation. In the mornings, workers cleared debris from the riverbanks. In the evenings, they gathered near the Peace Bridge and watched the sun set the same direction from which Enola Gay had come. No one spoke. Some nights, the sky glowed faintly red. They said it was only the reflection of the sun, but others believed it was the light remembering what it had done. Decades would pass before Hiroshima became a symbol rather than a scar. But in those first weeks, before monuments, before apologies, it was only a grave that refused to stay silent. And as the years turned, one truth remained, carved deeper than any monument: that morning's light, the first nuclear dawn, had not just ended lives. It had ended the illusion that humanity could ever be innocent again. Spring, 1946. Hiroshima breathed again, but not like before. The air was thinner, metallic. Every gust of wind carried dust from the ashes that had once been people. The Ota River flowed quietly now, its banks lined with wild grass pushing through the rubble, small and defiant. Amid the ruins, tents and wooden huts stood crooked but alive, the beginning of a city learning how to exist after ceasing to be. Keiji was 14 now. His hair had not grown back properly. It came in uneven patches. His gums still bled when he brushed his teeth, but he told no one. He spent his days hauling bricks from the old merchant quarter, clearing streets for the rebuilding teams. Each time his shovel struck the ground, he uncovered fragments of the past: a ceramic bowl fused to stone, a key without a door, a piece of roof tile bearing the shadow of a human hand burned into its glaze. At night, the survivors gathered around small fires. They spoke softly, telling each other where they had been when the light came. Some spoke for the first time since that morning. Others could not speak at all. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It carried the weight of memory. In one of the makeshift shelters, a young woman named Nakagawa Aiko organized the first group for orphaned children. There were hundreds of them, too many to count. She wrote their names on scraps of paper, tied them to the children's wrists, and promised to keep them safe. Most never learned her full name. They called her Sensei. And when she smiled, it was the only warmth left in their world. The American Strategic Bombing Survey arrived that same spring. Teams of scientists and photographers documented every meter of destruction, measuring radiation, cataloging human effects, mapping zones of total annihilation. They spoke to survivors, asking clinical questions. Where were you standing? How long until you lost consciousness? What color was the flash? Keiji was one of their subjects. He sat before the camera, shirtless, the scars on his chest still raw. The interpreter asked him to describe what he saw. He said nothing. The American soldier behind the lens adjusted the focus, muttered something, and clicked the shutter. The flash made Keiji flinch. He stood and walked away without a word. The survey team filed his photograph under the label Subject 47B Minor, 1.3 kilometers from hypocenter. By summer, the black rain had stopped falling, but its memory remained. People whispered about invisible sickness, the Adam's curse. They called it. Men who looked strong in June were dead by August. Women miscarried without warning. Children developed strange fevers that no doctor could explain. The survivors learned to live in uncertainty, as if each heartbeat were borrowed from an indifferent universe. And yet, life returned. A single tram line reopened. Shops were built from salvaged wood. Farmers from nearby villages brought rice and vegetables to trade. Each act of survival became a quiet rebellion against the silence left by the bomb. One evening, Aiko gathered the orphans by the river. She gave each a piece of paper and showed them how to fold cranes, the symbol of peace and healing in Japanese tradition. Their small hands, still scarred, moved slowly but with purpose. When they finished, she lit candles inside the cranes and set them afloat on the water. Hundreds of tiny lights drifted downstream, their reflections trembling across the current. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke and spring blossoms. Keiji watched from the bridge, remembering the first night he had done the same, when the river carried away his friends' names. This time, he felt no words, only the quiet conviction that the dead were watching, and that remembering them was enough. Years later, the city would rise again, concrete buildings, new streets, electric lights, but beneath the asphalt, beneath the museums and parks, lay the buried bones of August 6th. The past did not disappear. It lived beneath every step. And when people asked the Hibakusha what Hiroshima was like before the bomb, they would pause, look toward the river, and answer softly. It was full of laughter and light. We were just people, before we became a warning. August 6, 1950. 5 years since the flash that erased the morning, the city had changed, yet its silence had not. New houses stood where the ruins once smoldered, and children ran through streets that had no memory of fire. Electric lines buzzed faintly. Streetcars moved again, gliding past the skeletal remains of the Genbaku Dome left untouched, the one building that refused to fall, now blackened into a monument of memory. For the survivors, time had not healed, it had only learned to disguise the pain. The Hibakusha gathered each year by the river, dressed in white, carrying lanterns inscribed with names. The ceremony was quiet, no speeches, no applause, only the sound of paper rustling in the wind, the gentle slap of water against the banks. Keiji was 19 now. His body had outgrown the boyhood that the bomb had stolen, but his eyes were still those of someone who had seen too much light. He worked as a mason, rebuilding the same city that had burned his childhood away. Each brick he placed felt like an act of atonement, though he had nothing to atone for. On the morning of the anniversary, he joined the others at the Peace Memorial Park, still under construction. They stood in silence as the mayor read the names of those confirmed dead. There were so many that the list took hours. When the wind rose, ash from the incense burners swirled into the sunlight. A soft gray snow that fell on the faces of the living, and no one brushed it away. Nearby, Aiko, older now, her hair streaked with white, led a group of orphans in song. Their voices were small, almost shy, but clear, a hymn to the souls of the dead. Let the world remember. Let the fire never fall again. The words trembled, carried by the wind, rising toward the dome that still watched over them like a ghost that refused to leave. By then, the world had already changed. The Cold War had begun. The atomic age had become ordinary. The same power that had burned Hiroshima was now celebrated in laboratories, in textbooks, in military parades. Nations raced to build larger bombs, hydrogen, cobalt, thermonuclear, each one stronger than the last. Hiroshima was no longer a warning. It was a prototype. The survivors watched this new world with quiet disbelief. They had seen the end once. They knew what it looked like, but their voices weary, trembling, often ignored, spoke anyway. "We are not your lesson," they said. "We are your mirror." Keiji began visiting schools, telling children about that morning, about the light, the heat, the silence afterward. He never raised his voice, never dramatized. He spoke as one would read a prayer. Some children cried. Some didn't believe him. But each time he finished, he would lift a small, worn sandal from a cloth bag and place it on the table. Her name was Mika, he would say. She was 7. The room always fell silent after that. By the early 1950s, radiation sickness had taken many of the survivors. Leukemia was called the Adam's curse, and it came for the youngest first. Hospitals overflowed again, not with burns this time, but with invisible decay. Aiko visited them daily, her hands thin and trembling. She told stories to the children as they drifted in and out of fever, stories about rivers and cranes, and mornings that began with laughter. One of those children, before dying, asked her, "Sensei, what color was the sky before the bomb?" She smiled faintly. "Blue," she said. "Just blue." That same year, Keiji helped place the foundation stone for the Hiroshima Peace Memorial cenotaph. On it were carved the words that would define generations to come. "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." When the monument was unveiled, a hush fell over the crowd. No applause. Only the sound of cicadas, the same as on that morning 5 years ago. The same cry that had filled the air before the world had ended. And as the lanterns drifted once more down the river that evening, their light rippling over the water, like fragments of a broken sun, Keiji stood on the bridge and whispered what every survivor carried in silence. "The city that melted still burns inside us." August 6, 1965. 20 years after the morning that erased time, the river flowed quiet again. Its surface shimmered with the reflections of paper lanterns, hundreds of them, each one carrying a name written in brushstroke ink. The people called it Toro Nagashi, the floating of the spirits. Children's laughter mixed with the murmurs of prayer. The city, rebuilt from bones and shadows, now pulsed with life trams rattling, shopkeepers calling, bells echoing from temples. Yet beneath every sound, there was the memory of silence. Hiroshima had become a city of paradox, alive, but always mourning, modern, yet haunted. Where once fire had fallen, trees now stood tall, green, their roots in radioactive soil. The phoenix tree, the one that had sprouted beside the Aioi Bridge, now rose high above the Peace Memorial Park. Its leaves whispered when the wind passed through, as though retelling the names of those who could no longer speak. Keiji stood there that morning, now a man of 33. The scars on his arms had faded to pale silver, but the ache remained. He had spent 2 decades trying to live in a world that had learned nothing from the light. Bombs had fallen again in Korea, in the Pacific, in deserts across the world. The nations had divided themselves by fear and weaponry. Hiroshima had become a word spoken in conferences, textbooks, and treaties, a symbol that no one truly wanted to understand. In his pocket, Keiji carried a photograph, one of the few that survived. It showed his mother, Haruko, kneeling beside the river, her hands on a small sandal. He had found it years after the bombing in an old archive. The label read, "Anonymous Woman, August 6, 1945. He never corrected it. Some memories, he thought, belonged to everyone. At the Peace Memorial ceremony, the crowd stood as the mayor read the Declaration of Peace. The air was still. Birds circled high above the dome, silent against the blue sky, the same color Aiko had once described to the dying children. Keiji looked up, his eyes wet but steady. When the bell tolled at exactly 8:15 ma, the sound rippled across the city like a heartbeat remembered every year. It rang once clean, clear, unbroken, echoing through glass towers, across rivers, into the mountains. It was the sound of all those who could not speak saying, "We were here." After the ceremony, Keiji visited Aiko's grave. She had died the previous winter, her lungs failing from years of illness. The children she had saved had grown, had families, had stories. On her tombstone were the words she had often said to them. "If you live, you must tell them." He placed a single folded crane beside her name. Then he walked to the river and knelt at its edge. The water was cold, but he didn't pull back. He dipped his hands in, feeling the current move through his fingers, carrying away the ash of 20 years. The sun was high now, bright, golden, almost too warm. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I forgive the sky." Behind him, children's voices rose in laughter. The cicadas sang again, just as they had that morning in 1945. The same unbroken rhythm of life, relentless, fragile, unstoppable. And as the wind passed through the trees, carrying the scent of incense and summer grass, Hiroshima breathed not in grief, but in remembrance. Because the city that melted had not disappeared. It had become something else, a pulse beneath the world's conscience. A quiet voice repeating the same truth to every generation that tried to forget. This is what happens when light forgets mercy. August 6, 1985. 40 years since the morning that changed the nature of light. The city now gleamed with glass and steel. Neon lights reflected in the Ota River, where shadows once drifted in silence. Buses lined the rebuilt streets, and tourists with cameras wandered beneath signs that read, "Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park." Yet beneath the paved roads and new foundations lay a second city invisible, buried under meters of earth, the Hiroshima that never left. Every August, the air still grew heavy at dawn. The cicadas still cried. And when the bell tolled at 8:15, even the wind seemed to stop. Keiji, now an old man with trembling hands, stood among the crowd gathered before the cenotaph. His hair was white, his gait unsteady, but his eyes still the same dark, steady eyes of a boy who had seen the world end, watched the flame of peace burn against the morning sky. Around him were new generations who had never known war except through textbooks and stories. Some held their children in their arms. Others held photographs of ancestors who had been lost to the flash. He remembered his mother's touch, her laughter, the sound of her voice calling him home. He remembered Mika's sandal, its shape burned into his memory like the shadow on the bridge. He remembered Aiko's trembling hands folding cranes for the dying. And he remembered the silence, the terrible, endless silence after the light. The speaker's voice broke through his thoughts. "We gather not only to mourn, but to remember. Because to forget is to prepare the way for repetition." Behind the stage, a line of children released white doves into the sky. Their wings flashed against the sunlight, the same sunlight that once ignited the air itself. It was beautiful, but the beauty hurt. After the ceremony, Keiji walked slowly through the park. His cane clicked softly against the stones. He paused before the Genbaku Dome, now preserved behind barriers, its steel skeleton rusting gently under the years. Around it, the city moved bicycles, laughter, the rhythm of daily life. But inside the dome, the air was still, trapped in 1945. He placed his hand on the railing and whispered, "We built over you, but you still breathe." He knew his time was short. The sickness had returned, the same invisible poison that had taken so many before him. But he felt no anger, no bitterness, only the weight of memory and the duty it carried. In the evening, he returned to the riverbank. The lanterns floated again, thousands this time. The current caught their light, and the reflection trembled like stars fallen into the water. Keiji knelt, his breath shallow, his fingers shaking as he placed his own lantern on the surface. It carried a name written in careful strokes, Haruko and Mika. The current took it gently, joining the others as they drifted away, their glow fading into distance. He sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of the river. It was the same river that had carried death, then ashes, then prayers. Now it carried light. The city around him shimmered alive, rebuilt, unbroken. But to him, it was still the same Hiroshima, the same air, the same sky. He looked up at that sky, now cloudless and pure, and spoke softly, as if to the world itself. If you listen closely enough, you can still hear the morning that never ended. That night, he did not return home. The next morning, a caretaker found him by the river, seated peacefully beneath the bridge. The lanterns had all gone. The water was calm. His cane lay beside him, and in his hands, folded perfectly, was a single white paper crane. By the official count, 140,000 people died in Hiroshima by the end of 1945. Thousands more followed in the years after, from radiation, illness, and grief. Children of survivors were born with fragile bones, blood disorders, cancers, the inheritance of an invisible wound. The bomb that fell that morning, Little Boy, released energy equal to 15 kilotons of TNT, yet less than 2% of its uranium actually fissioned. The rest scattered into air, water, and flesh, a ghost that would never leave. Today, Hiroshima is vibrant. Its skyline glows at night. Students ride trams past the dome. Tourists eat by the river where bodies once floated. The city is alive because it remembers. Every August, thousands gather under the same sky to pray not for vengeance, but for the endurance of memory. In the Peace Memorial Museum stands a glass case. Inside it rests a small, charred sandal. Its label reads simply, "Belonged to a young girl, age 7, found near the Otta River, August 6, 1945. There are no other details, none are needed. Because in that single object, in its blackened leather, in its silence, lies everything that Hiroshima became: a warning, a wound, a promise. And when the bell rings each year at 8:15, its echo crosses oceans, through the noise of modern life, through the blindness of progress, whispering the same truth to every ear that will still listen. Never again should light be used to erase the living. The city that melted endures not as a ruin, but as memory incarnate. And as long as it remembers, so do we.